In this video, you're going to see a lot of abandoned stuff. Most of this area has been taken over by nature. The only part of the city that I go through in this video that has some life to it is Eastern Market, and it's actually a pretty neat district, as it has some of the best restaurant options in the city. As you look straight ahead, you can see some more Detroit industrial ruins, and what you're seeing straight ahead is the Thornapple Valley Slaughterhouse, which sits off of the DeQuinder Cut in Eastern Market. And for those who don't know, the DeQuinder Cut is an old railroad that's been turned into a recreational bike path. Anyway, this is going to be my 9th video on my Detroit series, where I end up going through the entire city. Soon I'll be in Eastern Market, and you'll be able to see all of its fame and glory. And here we're going over the DeQuinder Cut. It's not a very long pedestrian path, but what it does is give a bike path connection between Eastern Market and the Detroit Riverwalk, and that's certainly better than not having one. The railroad that used to lie here was the Grand Trunk Railroad line. Detroit has been a city that's been behind on the national trend of adding bike lanes to roads and streets and bike paths, but changes in that direction have been made slowly but surely. Well, this is Eastern Market, and ahead is the intersection of Wilkins and Russell, and I'm going to skip the footage ahead to a part that I had where I was driving south on Russell from Wilkins, and Russell is the main thoroughfare through Eastern Market. Eastern Market is located just northeast of downtown, and the best way to get here from downtown would be to take Gratiot Avenue northeast and then turn onto Russell, the street that we're on right now. To the west of Eastern Market is I-75, to the north is apartment buildings, to the east it's what used to be a residential neighborhood, and to the south it's the Lafayette Park neighborhood. In 1978, Eastern Market was added to the National Register of Historic Places. In 1891, sales sheds were built here, and these were the first buildings. We can still see them here today. The sheds were used for storage to supply the market. In 1922 and in 1929, more sheds were constructed. Eastern Market has always been an important spot in the city for wholesale foods, with the peak of business being right after World War II. The district consists of 80 different buildings, most of them are storefront brick. The city claims that Eastern Market today is the largest open-air flower bed market in the United States, and they also say that it's the largest historic public market district in the country. On Saturdays during the season in non-pandemic years, Eastern Market still sees a lot of traffic today, as it can see up to 45,000 people. Many of the storefronts are occupied, especially along Russell, and the city's website claims that there are 150 different businesses located in the district still today. Some of the streets that we go through in the district away from Russell are full of historic abandoned buildings that have been taken over by street art, and you'll see that shortly. I started the video in a vacant area, and I've mentioned how the area east of Eastern Market is an abandoned neighborhood. That was once an Italian neighborhood. It was mostly made up of Italian immigrants originally, but like most other ethnic groups within the city, they left for the suburbs once the city started to experience higher taxes, higher crime, bad public schools, and lower property values. And this street is used for truck deliveries for the storefronts that are facing Russell one block over. Ahead on the left is Shed 2, which is the most iconic one, and it has the words Eastern Market centered above. Shed 2 is the largest of 5 sheds, and it's the oldest, as it was built in 1898. The shed numbers go from 2 to 6, as Shed 1 was demolished in 1967 and is now a parking lot. And here you can start to see some boarded up buildings, but some of them are still in use as well, and you also have some street art on both sides of the street, making this street look pretty neat. Some of the more popular restaurants in Eastern Market include Supino Pizzeria, Zeff's Coney Island, Vivio's Food and Spirits, and the Detroit City Distillery, among many others. In recent news of the time that I uploaded this video, plans for a new food hall were announced, which included a rooftop bar. At the same time, a few older restaurants have announced that they're closing, such as a Louisiana Creole gumbo place that had been here for 50 years. The reason for the closure is because the owner of the building wanted to sell the building, therefore the Louisiana Creole gumbo restaurant had to move out. And I'm not sure what this is supposed to be, but it's interesting and adds to the artwork that we've seen throughout the area. And now we leave the Eastern Market area and we'll start exploring a mostly abandoned section of the city.
This part of the city isn't abandoned. There's still many people that call this neighborhood home. Plus, why not focus on the good things and make a video on Midtown or downtown?
I did make videos on the good places in Detroit. All you need to do is check out my Detroit playlist, which is linked below. Regarding this section of the city, well, we can let the viewers judge for themselves, because more often than not, we'll come across vacant lots where homes once stood, and we'll be seeing quite a few homes that would be better off demolished. I'll explain some reasons as to why this section of the city looks the way that it does throughout the rest of this video. One thing to look for to confirm that you're in Detroit is skid marks on the main roads, as people are always doing burnouts in the middle of the streets during the summer nights especially. Videos are all over YouTube of Detroit residents showing off their cars and blocking off traffic to do their burnouts in the middle of the streets, and you can see skid marks all over the city on the main thoroughfares. There's also plenty of people posting pictures of these illegal car meets on Instagram. When it gets really dangerous is when these groups will stop traffic on local freeways to do their stunts. With that said, I guess that you could say that these car meets are better than other variations of crime, but it's still crime nonetheless, as it's a disruption to the public by blocking public streets, and these car meets can sometimes encourage violent crime, as that's the type of crowd that it draws. There have been many news headlines over the years of a shooting or different fights that have broken out at these underground car meets. One that I can remember just off the top of my head is someone that was visiting Detroit from further north because he wanted to see what these were like. He wanted to be a part of the excitement, and then he ended up being a victim of a violent crime. Moving on now, violent crime has slowly been seeing a dip throughout Detroit over the last 10 years or so, but that's not saying much, as murders, car thefts, robberies, and assaults still go on in the city at an extremely high rate. Detroit was once unquestionably the most dangerous city in the United States, and that was a title that the Motor City held for decades. Since around 2010, cities like St. Louis, Baltimore, and Memphis have been put into the same category as Detroit in terms of violent crime rates. It depends on what source or publication that you look at today, but you'll often see St. Louis in first place among many of these lists that are either titled as America's murder capitals or America's most violent cities. Detroit is often in second place right behind St. Louis, and that's followed by Memphis and Baltimore. After these four cities, there's usually a giant gap in the violent crime rates before you get to cities that complete the top 10 lists, as these four cities routinely have a violent crime rate listed above 2,000 for every 100,000 residents. This particular list, that was published for the year 2022 from World Population Review, covers the most dangerous cities in the country and has St. Louis at the top 4 major U.S. cities. But like I said, the top 10 lists usually vary depending on the Nick Johnsons, the World According to Briggs, and other publications across the internet that you'll see. But you'll almost always see the same cities on every list regardless of the order that they're put in. Yeah, and in this part of the city, it's mostly just vacant block after vacant block. In the midst of all of this abandonment is an art project that is known as the Heidelberg Project. If you've been watching all of my videos in my Detroit series, you should know by now that having street art in blighted areas has become a trend in Detroit. The Heidelberg Project might be credited by starting that trend, as it was first created in 1986 by Tyree Guyton. Guyton was someone who served in the military back in the day, and when he returned home, his street looked like a war zone compared to what he remembered it as a kid, and that's what inspired him to create the Heidelberg Project. Most of us know that Detroit has lost more than 1 million residents from its 1950 peak of 1.8 million people, and it's actually the highest number of people to have left any city in the United States from its peak population. That's why so many of the city's neighborhoods are full of vacant lots and abandoned buildings. The only other large U.S. city to have lost a higher percentage of its peak population is St. Louis. The biggest reason for why people have left Detroit is because of racial tensions during the 1960s. Before that, black residents moved into Detroit from the South during the Great Migration to escape slavery and to find a better quality of life. Detroit had a large amount of manufacturing jobs, therefore it was an attractive place to move to at the time. Inside the city, certain parts would be designated towards black residents, while others would be left for white people to live in. This was called segregation. In 1967, black residents were upset over the Detroit Police Department using racial profiling and police brutality, and that sparked the largest riots that this country has ever seen, as 43 people died, 342 people were injured, and nearly 1,400 buildings had burned to the ground. That event scared many white people and helped spark a movement that was called white flight, where most of the white families with money moved to the suburbs for a better life. The ones who didn't have the money to move out were black residents at the time, and that left a demographic imbalance in place for the region. The city of Detroit once had over 80% of its residents as black residents, however today that number has dropped to 79%. On top of all that, in the 1980s and 90s, we started to see black residents move out to the suburbs, and that only increased the downward spiral that Detroit found itself in. As the wealthy continued to move towards the suburbs, the city was feeling the decline in tax revenue. Higher unemployment rates among the city's residents encouraged higher poverty rates. Gang violence, when it was at its peak in Detroit, helped make Detroit the most dangerous city in the country for a long time. It goes without saying that illegal drug activity goes hand in hand with the gang violence. However, over time, the economic downward spiral continued. One thing that didn't help was that Detroit was surrounded by highly attractive suburbs to live in and call home, where newer homes were being built up to code with nice big yards, whereas the housing stock in the Detroit city limits had much to be desired. Today, anybody that moves to the Detroit area is most likely moving to the suburbs, and it will likely stay that way until we start seeing some of the money in downtown's economic comeback reach the areas of the city that we're in right now. There are many other factors too, of course, into why Detroit has fallen so hard, including having too many corrupt politicians working for the city throughout the years who stole money from the city in a variety of different ways, a lack of investment in public schools and throughout the infrastructure in the neighborhoods, loss of manufacturing jobs within the city as they were replaced by other jobs in the suburbs, and higher tax rates for the residents of Detroit to try and make up for all of the residents and businesses that continued to leave the city. But hey, not all jobs have left the city. You still have this massive Pepsi plant right here, and just past it, you have a brand new Wolverine packing facility, opened in 2019. That's only a small piece to the puzzle though, as Detroit has lost 120,000 manufacturing jobs since its peak during the 1950s and 60s. There's a lot of work to still do, but Detroit is on the right path. It seems to finally have a sane mayor for the first time ever, so at least there's that. It's going to take a very long time to realistically build back up the neighborhoods throughout the city, as much of the city has been in decline for about 70 years at this point. Well, to the left is the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago's Detroit branch, and to the right is the Plymouth Education Center. It used to be a kindergarten through 12th grade school, but now it only goes to 8th grade. What you see here that's towering above the warehouses is what used to be one of the country's largest waste incinerators, a place where garbage was burned for electricity. The plant was shut down permanently back in 2019 due to the plant being too old and the costs to keep things running were too expensive. While the plant was open, there had been many emission violations given to the facility that was under private ownership. Some sources claim that the facility was receiving hundreds of violations per year. The property was blamed for producing foul odors in the surrounding community, ones that people would say smelled like rotten eggs, and it was close to many residential zoned areas. Historically, that's been one of Detroit's ongoing problems: poor city planning, putting polluting industries and other things such as waste incinerators near residential zones. And backtracking a little bit, you might have seen on the left back there along Russell that a new building was being constructed. This is the new Wayne County Jail, and the jail was supposed to be constructed in downtown originally, but back in 2018, Detroit billionaire Dan Gilbert struck a deal with the city to place the jail away from downtown and put the development in downtown towards a better use in the future. We were just at the intersection of Russell and Milwaukee. We're heading east on Milwaukee, and to the left you have a couple of junkyards, and that's just mixed in with a bunch of abandoned buildings. And now we're just going to head back north on Russell, continuing on the path that we were on. To the right is the massive Russell Industrial Center. Originally, the building opened in 1915 after a decade of construction for the use of manufacturing sheet metal parts for automobiles. It was the Murray Body Corporation that used this facility originally, and it became the third largest auto body supplier in the nation after Fisher and Briggs, companies that were also located in the Motor City. Today, the center is used by a bunch of hipsters for art studio space, with some shops inside the center too. The center's website claims that it's home to over 100 small businesses and artists. Looks like it costs around $600 to rent a small space, $1,100 a month for a medium space, and for a large space you have to click on the link to see the price. Maybe if I pierce my ears, start wearing a beanie and skinny jeans, they'll cut me a deal for setting up a video editing suite for my YouTube ventures. Yeah, maybe I'll look into that. The center has also been used to film several movies, most of them though have been on the local scale. From here, I skip the video to a part where I'm driving by the Hamtramck plant, sometimes referred to as the Poletown plant. This plant was constructed here back in 1981 and is massive in size. The plant was actually built under eminent domain, as it cleared out the neighborhood that used to be Poletown. The 465 acres of Poletown that were demolished for this plant included 1,500 homes, 144 businesses, and 16 churches, which forced around 4,200 people to relocate. At the time, it was the most number of people forced to move by a government entity in the shortest amount of time. The new plant was promised to provide 6,000 new jobs, but when the facility opened in 1985, the plant provided only half of the amount of the original promised amount of jobs. Side note, as if you remember me talking about the illegal car meets that occur here in Detroit, this stretch of East Grand Boulevard was one of the hot spots during the summer of 2021 for these illegal car meets. Anyway, back to the plant, as in 2018, GM announced that they were going to close the Hamtramck plant. However, in 2021, GM announced that the Hamtramck facility would be used for producing electric vehicles. We're now going to be on Chene Street, which was one of the major commercial thoroughfares through Poletown back when it existed, and commercial businesses once lined the thoroughfare all the way from here down towards Gratiot. Today it's one of the most depressing and abandoned streets in all of Detroit. It's hard to imagine that this used to be a lively street full of retail stores. Apparently, there used to be over 200 of them. There is even a group called the Chene Business Association. This area is what the city calls today East Poletown. Remember that the original Poletown was located where the massive assembly plant is that I just showed you. Polish immigrants used to be the majority of the residents in this area that we're in currently. This was all back in the 1920s through the 50s. When free slaves started to move to Detroit, this area also supported a large black population. Both immigrant groups were discriminated against, but this community was strong as the population provided a unique set of skills and trades to be small business owners. This store right here was once Max's jewelry store, and it was once owned by Sam Rosenbaum, who was one of the more successful business owners during the prime of this neighborhood. This neighborhood started to decline back in the 1970s along with the rest of the city. As people left, so did the businesses and shops that once lined this thoroughfare. St. Stanislaus was a Roman Catholic church that served the Polish population of this area, and by the mid-70s, they closed their junior high school and senior high schools associated with the church as enrollment counts continued to drop. Going back a little bit in time, the decline likely started with the 1967 riots, or sometimes referred to as the 1967 Rebellion. Many of the business owners were robbed at gunpoint along Chene Street during that time, and that encouraged the start of the downward spiral that continued on in this neighborhood for the following decades. Much of the Polish population that once lived here moved into suburbs such as Warren and Sterling Heights further north, and that just followed the same trend of other immigrant groups that were once in the city. To the left is probably something that you wouldn't expect, as it's a nice-looking high school football field. There's no school on any of the blocks surrounding the football field either. It's all abandoned homes and vacant lots. Apparently, it's used by the Detroit Edison Public School Academy, which is located about 5 blocks west. And you can always get a nice view of the downtown skyline heading towards downtown along Gratiot Avenue. But from here, I'm going to skip the video ahead to where I'm heading north on McDougall, which is another north and south thoroughfare through this section of the city, and it looks pretty bad just like Chene Street does. And from here, I wanted to head down one last thoroughfare through this area, which will be Gratiot Avenue. To the right is the Faygo Headquarters, and they've been at this spot along Gratiot Avenue since 1935. I think it's safe to say that this area was a lot different back then than it is today. Faygo was founded in 1907 by Ben and Perry Fagenson, who recently came from Russia. The beverage was mostly a local drink until around 1960 when Faygo started to advertise with the Detroit Tigers, and around that time, it became known on a national scale. Otherwise, the rest of Gratiot Avenue is full of liquor lotto stores and Dollar General stores and abandoned buildings. Well, that's about it for this video, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, as doing all of those things helps these videos destroy the evil monster that is the YouTube algorithm. Also, make sure to hit that notification bell so that you can be notified every time that I upload a new video. If you enjoyed this video, then you might enjoy checking out some of the featured playlists on this channel. Videos with amazing insights on other places like what you saw here can be found in my Detroit playlist, my American Hoods playlist, or in my Michigan playlist. Last but not least, if you can't get enough of me on here, you can always go follow me on my other social media accounts, and those links are below. We'll see you next time. Peace!